Musical chairs in the Cabinet and, yes, Minister, it's time to go. Defence Minister Joel Fitzgibbon, the Coalition's first scalp from the Rudd government. Ms Bishop, the Deputy Opposition Leader, and the rest of the Coalition have been relentlessly urging Mr Fitzgibbon to step down. On Thursday, he did, after allegations of a breach in the Ministerial Code of Conduct. The PM quickly renamed the tough veteran Senator John Faulkner as his replacement, followed by a cabinet reshuffle yesterday, trying to move the media onto a new agenda. And here to talk with us about all this is Deputy Opposition Leader Julie Bishop. Ms Bishop, thank you very much for joining us on Sunday Agenda. Now, before we go to local events and the President of the United States, can I ask you about the British government's major crisis? Now, Prime Minister Gordon Brown has had 7 ministers resign and a pretty devastating local election result in the past week. Is it time for him to step down?
The British government is clearly in chaos, given the number of ministers, including senior ministers, who have resigned or stepped down. It means that the government is not focused on the business of the day, and Britain is facing a significant financial crisis. The focus appears to be all on the conduct and behaviour of various ministers, and so that's creating great instability. And the Prime Minister has indicated that he will stare down the critics and continue on until the election. But commentators say, were an election held this week, the Tories would win that election. So it's clearly a time of great instability within the British government.
Should he go?
Well, that's a matter for the Prime Minister. Obviously, I'm not going to suggest to a foreign Prime Minister what he should do, but as an objective observer, the government is in chaos, and unless he can assemble a team that is above reproach, then I think this scandal about the expenses will continue to dog him. And as I say, it's taken the focus off the significant issues, not only in economic policy, but also in foreign policy.
Let's look at local issues now. Is the Joel Fitzgibbon controversy over? Your side of politics has hinted that there may still be more allegations to come, or has the government managed to swing the agenda onto new things by creating a cabinet reshuffle and moving up Greg Combet and Chris Bowen and Mark Arbib?
What the Prime Minister has done is removed Joel Fitzgibbon from the line of fire. We certainly had more questions, more lines of inquiry of him over his behaviour going back months. This is a minister who has very questionable behavioural issues, also in relation to his judgment on a number of matters and also his competence. So there were many unanswered questions about his honesty, his competence, his judgment. By removing him to the back bench, the Prime Minister has essentially taken him out of the line of questioning. But the cabinet reshuffle indicates that the New South Wales Labor Party still calls the shots. This is the faction that delivered the numbers to Mr Rudd to topple Kim Beazley for the leadership. Mr Fitzgibbon was from that faction. He was clearly rewarded with the Plum defence role for his support of Mr Rudd, not for his experience or competence in matters to do with the defence portfolio. That's been quite evident from subsequent events. But also this reshuffle indicates a triumph for the New South Wales Labor Party. Now, some would say that if you were looking for competence in
Greg
government...
Combet is not from the New South Wales Labor Party.
Well, I'm talking about Mark Arbib and Chris Bowen. If you were looking for competence in government, you would not go to the New South Wales Labor Party. But Chris Bowen has been promoted into cabinet, yet he leaves behind 3 major policy failures: Fuel Watch, Grocery Watch, and even yesterday, as he was being promoted into cabinet, he was trying to shuffle over the cracks in the employee share scheme. So clearly policy success was not a criteria for being promoted into cabinet.
OK, so you think on that basis Chris Bowen should not have been promoted at all?
Well, he has left behind a legacy of policy failures: Fuel Watch, Grocery Watch, the employee share scheme, which the new minister will have to somehow fix that policy failure. So I can't see that policy success has been a criteria for promotion into cabinet.
Greens leader Bob Brown says there were not enough women elevated to cabinet. Would you agree with that?
Well, clearly there are no women in the New South Wales Right faction, because that is the faction that has triumphed in this latest reshuffle.
Do you think there should be more women elevated into the federal cabinet?
I think women should be promoted on merit, and there are some competent women who were clearly overlooked. There was another strategic change, and that is Senator Jan McLucas has been forced to resign. There were questions over her living arrangements that have been raised in the media, and clearly she would have been in a line of questioning in the Senate, and she's now gone. But I would suggest the government should always promote on merit, and there clearly were some women who should have been promoted, but again, they're not in the New South Wales right faction, so they were not rewarded.
On the defence portfolio, you've said that Senator Faulkner has a very tough road ahead, partly because he has to rebuild relations between the department and the ministerial office, boosting the morale of troops who, were hit by a pay scandal earlier this year, and also making the reforms in the Defence White Paper work. Can he do it?
Senator Faulkner was an obvious choice. He's a very experienced parliamentarian, so I understand why the Prime Minister promoted him to take the place of Joel Fitzgibbon, but he does face significant challenges. The first, I would suggest, is to restore the trust between the Minister's office and the department, and secondly, and most importantly, to restore morale within the Defence Forces. We have men and women serving on the front line in Afghanistan, overseas, and they must be able to have absolute confidence that the government knows what it's doing when it comes to defence and security. So I think that is the priority. Secondly, of course, Senator Faulkner has to implement this white paper, a somewhat incoherent paper, but it does require significant expenditure. There is no funding plan attached to the white paper, and this is at a time.
Will go ahead?
Well, this is at a time when the government has driven the country into an unprecedented level of debt, $315 billion of debt, at a time when they're suggesting that we should increase defence spending. But also, Senator Faulkner is charged with finding $20 billion in savings in defence. So I don't think anyone underestimates the challenges he faces.
Those savings, can he find them? Could anyone find them?
It's questionable. It is a very big ask. I think they've raised expectations that the Labor Party will be able to deliver on this massive expenditure. Yet on the other hand, the Treasurer says that they're going to hold spending in order to pay off the debt. It's an inconsistent position. They're promoting significant defence spending on one hand, and on the other hand they're saying that they're going to hold back expenditure in order to pay off the massive debt that they've now driven up.
The Prime Minister and the Treasurer were both very happy that Australia avoided a technical recession this week, but they have warned that Australia is not out of the woods, and they've warned that unemployment will still climb. Now, do you think we are still heading for a recession?
Mr Rudd and Mr Swan were, even as recently as yesterday, giving themselves 10 out of 10 for their management of the economy. But before the backslapping and self-congratulation goes too far, I think we should be first very concerned about the legacy of debt that this government has built up. I mean, this is an unprecedented level of debt that somehow is going to have to be repaid.
Do you think we will avoid a recession, or will we still head into recession?
Well, if you speak to small business, as I have been, business is still doing it tough. They're concerned about turnover, they're concerned about keeping people on, so people are losing their jobs, and I think unemployment is perhaps a much more significant indicator of whether Australia will or will not avoid a recession than a technical definition of recession.
Okay, I want to move on because we've got a few other issues to cover. The recent attacks on Indian students have certainly created a lot of angst and anger at home, but it's created a huge amount of anger towards Australia in India. Now, India sends a lot of students to Australia. How best can we restore our reputation and rebuild our relations with India?
International education is one of our most significant exports. This exchange of foreign students into Australia and Australian students going overseas is very significant for us, not only in terms of export dollars, but also the exchange of cultural ideas, and I can't think of any better form of diplomacy than having young people study, work,
so how do we
get over the problem,
Australia? Quell the issue?
Well, clearly it's a police matter for a start. These are criminal acts, and therefore the police should be doing their role as best they can. But secondly, the universities families need to ensure that these students are welcomed, living in a safe environment and are supported. And I think that's very important, as well as the messages our leadership provide. Both the Prime Minister and Malcolm Turnbull, as Leader of the Opposition, made very forceful statements in the Parliament this week, stating that it is absolutely unacceptable that this kind of violence should be perpetrated against young students of any nationality. And so that's a very strong message that we must continue to reinforce. But as I said, it is a police matter at the outset.
Moving on to the Obama speech in Cairo, I mean, it seemed to be a circuit-breaking speech in many ways. It certainly earned the praise of many moderates in the Middle East. But there's still a long way to go, isn't it? It's just one speech.
Well, President Obama did say that. It was a magnificent speech, but he pointed out that it was just the beginning. One speech cannot solve all the problems. He laid out a number of ideals, values, aspirations that were not just American ideals, but the kind of aspirations that people around the world can support, and I think that was very important. He had a number of themes, from religious freedom and democracy through to violent extremism, women's rights. He touched on some taboo subjects. He was very forthright about Israel and the Palestinian situation, and I think from that point of view, his frank and open honesty about the problems that the world is facing was very refreshing and welcome. It was interesting that he spoke in diplomatic terms of a relationship between the United States and the Muslim world. Traditional diplomacy is between nation-state and nation-state, but he was speaking about the Muslim world. So he was reaching out to Muslims wherever they may live. And the Muslim world, of course, is very diverse geographically and culturally, from the Middle East through to, say, Indonesia and Africa. So it was a very powerful message. Now, the question is, history will judge whether it's been a success or not, but it was a step forward. Some say a modest step, but it was definitely a step in the right direction.
You said it was a refreshing speech, his approach. Was it so different to the last approach?
Well, refreshing in the sense that he quoted the Quran. I don't know that many American presidents have done that in the past, so that was very respectful. He spoke about Palestine. He didn't avoid the word by saying a Palestinian state. He actually said Palestine, and
he also didn't avoid saying Israel either.
No, indeed.
To a group of Arab listeners.
Indeed, and so he said he wanted to say it as it is, and I think that he did do that. And history will judge whether the speech is the turning point that so many people hope it will be. Many of the themes were, of course, themes of the previous administration about democracy and religious freedom. They were themes that previous presidents have promoted.
But a very starkly different way of putting it.
And also, let's face it, he is an African-American president. He has lived in Muslim countries. He brings a whole different characteristic to the argument, and I think that that was something that made the Middle East sit up and take notice.
Julie Bishop, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Helen.